boys and girls. A special hello goes out to the Director of Media for the Boston Bruins alumni, Mr. Mark Boland. I see you, Marky.
Welcome to the Pro Hockey Alumni Podcast, the voice of hockey legends. This show is created to give a voice to former pro players and personalities, allowing them to share some of the greatest stories this game has to tell. So let's take a trip to the heart of the classic hockey universe and celebrate the history of the game with the select few who actually lived it. Episode 63 of the Pro Hockey Alumni Podcast features a look back at the Kansas City Scouts NHL franchise with author Troy Treasure, and my review of the historic New England Whalers' upset win over the Soviet national team on December 27, 1976. Troy Treasure's book, Icing on the Plains, is the story of Kansas City's attempt to integrate Major League Hockey into its sports marketplace, only to see it all fall through thin ice. Painstakingly researched, Icing on the Plains features great hockey stories and some of the most colorful people in the game. In this interview, we'll recall the triumphs and tragedies of this often forgotten franchise that would go on to become the Colorado Rockies and eventually the New Jersey Devils. In our previous two episodes, you've heard some of the Scout stories from Denis, Herron, and Robin Burns. And in this episode, we'll complete our KC Scouts trilogy with discussions about the Scouts and NHL personalities such as Wilfred Paiement, Steve Durbano, Michel Plasse, Simon Nolet, Sid Abel, Dan Kelly, Bep Giedlin, Peter McDuffe, and many more. Before talking with Troy, I'll review the New England Whalers' improbable WHA win over the touring Soviet national team in 1976, a game that was easily the top game of the Whalers' WHA years in Hartford. And Whalers center Mike Rogers will help us recall some moments from this great game in Hartford hockey history. We greatly appreciate all of you who have subscribed, rated, and reviewed the PHA podcast on iTunes and Apple Podcasts. You've helped make the show more visible to fans around the world. In fact, we are now ranked among the top hockey podcasts in the US and Canada. If you haven't already, please rate and review the show. We greatly appreciate your support. Remember, home base for the show is prohockeyalumni.org. Reach out anytime with comments or suggestions. Pro Hockey Alumni Podcast is joined with NHL alumni Tom Laidlaw, Frank Simonetti, and Ken Hodge Jr. in support of the Warrior for Life Fund and the Navy SEAL Foundation. Please visit warriorforlifefund.org for more information. Now, let's talk classic hockey.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, once again, let's have a greeting for your New England Whalers.
On December 27, 1976, the New England Whalers were clinging to fourth place in the WHA's East Division. Coach Harry Neal's crew had suffered an uninspiring 4-1 loss to the touring Czech team a week earlier, and as a sellout crowd of 10,507 settled into their Hartford Civic Center seats, there was little reason to believe the Whalers would perform any better against the superior Soviet Union. Making the contest even more foreboding for the Whalers was the absence of their top three defensemen, Rick Lee, Brad Selwood, and Tommy Abrahamson. In fact, you could make the case that the Whalers lineup on this specific night was the weakest lineup of any Whalers team in any single game in their entire 27-year existence. While the line of Tom Webster, Mike Rogers, and George Lyle was among the WHA's best, the Whalers would also need contributions from slow-skating enforcers like Dale Smedsmo and James Troy, as well as minor league call-ups and cast-offs like Gary Swain, Gary McGregor, Tom Earl, and Denny Arndt. Due to the aforementioned injuries, defense featured just two pairings, 18-year-old Gordy Roberts with his brother Doug Roberts, and Alan Hanksleben with Ron Busnick. The Whalers goaltender Cap Rader, who also spent the early part of the season in the AHL, would play just 28 regular season games in the WHA. And on this night, he'd have to duel Vladislav Tretiak, considered by many to be the world's premier goaltender. Now, this was the first of a 8-game WHA tour for the Soviets, and the potential for jet lag loomed. In addition, injuries would sideline the top line of Valery Harmilov, Boris Mikhailov, and Sergei Petrov. Still, the Soviet team was loaded with legends like Alexander Yakushev, Alexander Maltsev, Vladimir Shadrin, Boris Alexandrov, Helmut Balderas, and many more. Calling the action for PBS in the U.S. was Spencer Ross, with color commentary from hockey neophyte Bill Rasmussen, who would soon be fired by the Whalers. But of course, he'd find redemption by creating the Entertainment and Sports Network, ESPN. Incidentally, the Whalers' PA announcer is Scott Rasmussen, now best known for his political polling agency, Rasmussen Reports. Now let's catch the action in the first period of the game when Gary Swain, who played just 27 WHA games in this season, thrilled the crowd with the game's first goal on a deflection of a Doug Roberts shot.
Luchenko, kept in by Doug Roberts, puts it up, score! And the Whalers have taken the lead by a score of 1-0.
Number 20, New England.
Swain's old penalty-killing partner Tommy Earle, recalled from the AHL earlier in the day, gave the Whalers a 2-goal bulge when he sailed a 35-foot wrister past a stunned Tretiak at 15:26.
Busnick on the rebound. This is Swain. Out of the penalty box, Bialyedinov. And now out of the box comes Roberts. Tommy Earle coming in, shoot, score! And the Whalers lead it 2-0.
This is Tommy Earle, just called back today from Providence to play in this game.
Goalie Cap Rader then made his only mistake of the night when he whiffed on a long Alexander Maltsev wrist shot. But Gary McGregor reestablished the Whalers' 2-goal lead with a deflection of a Denny Bulldog shot at 17:19, and it's 3-1 Whalers.
Hanksleben shoots back. Bolden. Around Lyopkin. It's fair, score! Tretiak appears to have it. And then it's deflected in. Danny Bolden makes it a 3-1 hockey game.
I don't know if he's going to give credit to Bolduc or to McGregor. 21 and 12. Bolduc fired it, and McGregor was climbing all over Tretiak in the goal mouth, and I don't know. I thought that if he got his stick on it, it would have been too high and disallowed, but Bill Friday waved it off, so presumably, well, let's listen.
Scored by number 12, Gary McGregor.
It was McGregor getting the goal.
Assisted by number 21, Danny Bolduc. And number 9, Ralph Backstrom. Time of the goal, 17.
Gary McGregor is an interesting story. He scored 100 goals for the OHA Cornwall Royals in 1973-74, and he followed that with a 42-goal rookie campaign with the WHA Chicago Cougars in 74-75. However, his career fell off dramatically thereafter. He played just 30 games for the Whalers in the 76-77 season before being dispatched to the Indianapolis Racers. Tragically, McGregor passed away suddenly at the age of just 40 years old. The Whalers ended period 1 with a 19-8 shot advantage and a 3-1 lead, but that surely would be reversed in period 2. The Soviets outshot the Whalers 13-3 in that middle stanza amidst numerous power play chances, but Rader repelled each Soviet attempt. In fact, the Soviets would have a whopping 12 power play opportunities on this night. The Soviets continued their assault in period 3 when Hall of Famer Alexander Yakushev closed the gap to 3-2 with a goal at 5:22.
Yakushev, he's been foiled tonight. Saved by Cap Raider. Danny Yarn has it for the Whalers. New England leading 3-1. We're in the third period. Viktor Shalamov. A good move. The save by Raider. Rebound. Yakushev scores.
Can only hold him off the board so long, and Yakushev, there you see him. Big left winger makes it 3-2 at 5 minutes, 22 seconds of the period.
This was the point when many figured the game surely would turn for the Soviets. But tough guy James Troy, who totaled exactly 0 points in 23 career Whalers games, threaded a perfect pass on the right wing boards to George Lyle near the crease, and suddenly it was 4-2 Whalers.
Here's Gordy Roberts. Two good defensive plays by Roberts on the sequence. Troy at front, score! Jim Troy with a perfect centering pass, and George Lyle was there to make it 4-2.
Jim Troy on that one, number 25, taking a shift in place of Tom Webster on that line with Lyle and Rogers, and he laid a perfect pass in front for the big rookie from Michigan Tech to pop behind the goaltender.
A 2-goal lead was always shaky against this explosive Soviet squad, but the game was settled when, in the game's final minute, George Lyle deked Tretiak for his second goal of the night, and the Hartford Civic Center crowd exploded into a bedlam.
Swain, Earl, McGregor, and Lyle, Yakushev and Maltsev have scored for the Soviet team, and we're into the final minute of the hockey game. Bench.
Fiery flow to Rogers. Here's the break pass to Lyle coming in. Score! Lyle beats Tretiak to make it 5-2.
Look at the Whalers out on the ice, en masse, to congratulate George Lyle. What a pass out front. And look at the Hartford Civic Center bedlam tonight. Nobody's sitting down now, Spence, except you and me.
Despite Cap Raiders' heroics, Gary Swain, with a goal and an assist coupled with tireless penalty killing, was named the game's most valuable player. Now, recently I had the chance to talk with Mike Rogers about this magical evening in Whalers history.
Well, for me personally, it was kind of my Stanley Cup, I guess, the seventh game of the Stanley Cup final, because we knew what the Russians were about. And I think the biggest thing is we just did not want to get embarrassed. And right. I think that was kind of the talk in the dressing room before the game. Let's just go out and play the way that we can. Let's play Canadian hockey and kind of, that's always been that let's be physical, but not go, too much and just kind of go out and play as hard as we possibly can and see what happens. And, at the end of that game and to sit back in that dressing room afterwards and realize, we beat world champions. We beat one of the best teams that have ever put skates on. So obviously, again, a huge, huge thrill and something I'll never forget.
As a postscript to the game, the Soviets would rebound to reel off 6 consecutive tour wins, including a 10-1 drubbing of the Houston Aeros, before dropping the tour finale to the eventual Avco Cup champion, Quebec Nordiques. The Whalers, on the other hand, would go on to lose their next 3 WHA games, and in mid to late January would stumble further with a miserable 0-8-1 stretch. By season's end, many of the players in this game against the Soviets would never play for the Whalers or any other big league team ever again. But for this one unforgettable night in the Insurance City, this patchwork collection of New England Whalers sat atop the hockey world.
9 seconds remaining. That'll do it. The Whalers are going to win it. Slow. Roberts saved by Tretiak, and that is it. And listen to this crowd. And they're giving Cap Raider more trouble than the Soviets gave him tonight.
I think you're right. There's a chance to not only listen, but to look at the crowd. Final score 5-2 before a packed house.
McElroy passes out and then gets it back to Giroux. Giroux kicking that puck as he backhands it into hot zone. Esposito whacks at it and gets it out to Mulvey. Mulvey goes crashing in to Dallas, and there's a score by Will Paiement, and Kansas City has got a goal as Will Paiement gets the first goal ever for the home team in this arena.
We're back on the show, and we're thrilled to have author Troy Treasure, who, for you, we have a lot of fans out here in New Jersey. And it's a little genealogy lesson for you. It's a little backtracking history before the Devils and before the Colorado Rockies, of course. The birth rights of this franchise belonged in Kansas City, home of the Kansas City Scouts, and maybe not be the most memorable or lovable franchise of all time. But in the book Icing on the Plains, Troy Treasure makes their story very interesting, compelling, an outstanding book, which we highly recommend. And thank you, Troy, for joining us on the show today.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it, Mark.
You did a great job of setting the scene in the Kansas City sports scene at that time. But what were the conditions such that people thought that Kansas City had a shot at having a successful NHL expansion franchise?
Well, the St. Louis Blues put their Central Hockey League team in Kansas City when St. Louis was a part of the league doubling its size for the 67-68 season. And minor league hockey, the Kansas City Blues went over very well. But prior to that, primarily in the 30s, dating back to the 20s actually, through the 30s, then World War II, of course, disrupted a lot of things. And then in the 50s, there were different minor league teams. So the sport at the minor league level was pretty popular. Unfortunately, as far as going to the National Hockey League, there wasn't a building that met all the requisites that the NHL would want. And Kansas City folks were told by Clarence Campbell, among other people, that if that metro area were to construct a new, modern athletic arena, then Kansas City had a good chance because, as you have alluded to, another league had cranked up. And I don't need to tell you, Mark, and your listeners, the reason that Atlanta and Long Island got NHL franchises in 72 was to thwart the WHA from getting to those markets. So in its genesis, everything was contingent on a new arena, and ultimately it went through its struggles being constructed. There were work stoppages, and in fact, there was controversy on where Kemper Arena would end up. It ended up down in the Stockyard District, down in the river bottoms of Kansas City, but it got built, and 4 groups, they put in bids for the Kansas City franchise. One group got it, called Kansas City Hockey Associates, and away they went.
That they did. So it's interesting if you're looking at the various expansions up at to that time, and this was probably the most challenged expansion. So, and that's for a couple of reasons, in my opinion. First of all, you alluded to the World Hockey Association at various points. At one point, I think 75, there were 31 teams between the NHL and WHA, and obviously a paucity of talent to fill those roster spots. So when the Vancouver Canucks and the Buffalo Sabres came into the fold in the NHL in 70-71, by the time 74-75 came around, the Canucks had won their Smythe division. The Sabres were in the Stanley Cup Finals. The Sabres, of course, drafted Perreault, then Rick Martin, and Jim Schoenfeld, and Denis Gare. And the road to success seemed to be relatively short. And Atlanta and the Islanders, Atlanta, had a kind of a veteran team. They were able to get some decent veteran defensemen, obviously good goaltending. So the Atlanta Flames were respectable right off the bat. The Islanders had a horrendous first season, but that only led them to get Dennis Potvin and then a series of incredible drafts in the 70s. So their road to the top was relatively quick. They were in the NHL Stanley Cup semifinals within 3 years. On the other hand, by the time you get to 74-75, there is first of all, they weren't great draft years. They lowered the draft age in 74, 75, 74, but to fill those rosters out was I'm rambling a little bit here, but my point being, and I'd see if you would agree, that the challenge of the expansion rules at that time weren't like Las Vegas was most recently. At that point, not only were the expansion rules kind of tough, but there wasn't a lot of talent to go around at that point, and these teams were relatively doomed, both the Capitals and the Scouts, right from the start. That's a long monologue, but do you agree with that?
Yes, I do. And as far as Vegas compared to previous expansions, the difference was like night and day. But back in the mid-'70s, and actually the franchises in D.C. and Kansas City were granted in 1972, the other owners in the National Hockey League, they didn't care whether those two teams were successful. That's obvious. I mean,
right.
The expansion draft process was BS. And, Milt Schmidt, the general manager with the Capitals, and his counterpart, Mr. Sid Abel in Kansas City, they had extreme slim pickings from which to choose. And then you talk about the amateur draft, you're right. In 74, they did lower the age down to 18, and Kansas City got a good player in Wilfred Paiement. Paiement was the second overall pick in that amateur draft behind Washington's Greg Jolly, but Kansas City ended up having to pay him a 3-year deal, $600,000, just to get this 18-year-old to sign. Now, Paiement only lasted in Kansas City for 2 years, so Kansas City only paid him $400,000. But the point was, is, and this is tied in with the rival league too, is that players' salaries just escalated, and Kansas City Hockey Associates nor Abe Poland in Washington had any idea when they were getting into this that the salaries would increase so rapidly.
Right. Well, I think that some of the early decisions that Kansas City made weren't bad ones. Bep Guidlin, who, of course, was in the Stanley Cup Finals with the Boston Bruins in 1974, and Sid Abel, a good, capable hockey man, as they say. As you noted, the first ever draft pick was a hit with Wilf Paiement, with the price tag, of course. The Capitals had their first pick and missed with Greg Jolly. You know, again, the goaltending right off the bat, if I recall correctly, Michel Plasse was the first goaltender. So they had a decent goaltender in Kansas City right away. But as you said, the conditions were ripe for failure. And it's incredible when you look back at it that the Capitals, credit to Abe Poland, because they labored through many years of misery before finally seeing the other side. And Kansas City, of course, didn't have that opportunity. The interesting thing is, when you look at it, Troy, the team moves to Colorado, and that doesn't work. And then to New Jersey, and that really takes a while to catch on. But things change. I mean, demographics change, people's tastes change. And with that in mind, Kansas City had been rumored at various expansions over time. And even though it didn't work in the mid-'70s, do you think that Kansas City would be a capable alternative for a future expansion or franchise relocation in the NHL today? Well, I'm in the minority with my take on it, but I think Kansas City could add to its sports marketplace, and of course there's an NFL franchise and Major League Baseball franchise. I think it could handle either an NBA team or an NHL team. There is a building there. It is a modern building. Having said that, it's got about, I'm going to guess, about 10 years on it now. And we all know how these arenas and stadiums seemingly become obsolete way before you think. But I will say this: it will not be an expansion team if it's the NHL. It would be, and I've got an opinion on an individual that could get involved with a group that might be interested in buying. Let's just say hypothetically, the Arizona Coyotes or the Florida Panthers, and bringing them to the Sprint Center. And that individual's name is Clark Hunt, and he is the son of Lamar Hunt, founder of the American Football League and longtime owner of the Kansas City Chiefs. He's of course deceased now, but Clark is one of the sons. Another son of Lamar Hunt Jr., is a huge hockey guy.
He owns the ECHL team in Independence, which Independence, Missouri is probably best known for its association with President Harry S. Truman. But that's an eastern suburb of Kansas City, and he's put money into rinks in the area. I believe he's bringing in a United States Hockey League team, one of those developmental teams. You know, a lot of the guys will play in the USSR. You know, they maintain their amateur standing and college eligibility, and a lot of them go on to four-year schools collegiately. But Clark Hunt is the chief operating officer of the Kansas City Chiefs, and he's got, along with Lamar Jr., I want to say, I could be wrong, but 3 other siblings. Maybe it's just 4. I think 2 sisters are involved. In other words, I think, I'm getting long-winded here too, if the Hunt family were to get totally involved in the pursuit of an existing NHL team that's for sale, I could see it shaken down for Kansas City returning to the National Hockey League. But let me reiterate, it will not be an expansion franchise again.
The biggest question I guess I should have led with is why write this book, Troy? Why write the Kansas City Scouts tome? Like I said before the call, somebody had to do it. God bless you for doing it. The record's out there, but it had to be some driving force for you to capture all this detail and all this great information on this relatively forgotten NHL team.
Well, that's a complicated question to answer, but on the other hand, not so complicated, I guess. First of all, a book on the Kansas City Scouts had never been done before. And I can understand that, but that leads me into some of the other reasons that I decided to do it. The Scouts were my first exposure to the sport when I was 8 years old. And I fell in love with the sport. Mark, all of us fell in love with hockey for some reason or another. And my reason was the Kansas City Scouts. In addition, when I began work on the project in the fall of 2016, my mother had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, and her husband had passed away. So I became primary caregiver for my mother, and she did pass away in May of this year. But you know, I had to leave newspapering. I'd done radio prior. I've kind of done a mix of broadcast and newspapering, as a lot of guys do. But I had the time, basically, to do the research, and that was difficult at times. Well, I shouldn't say that. I loved going through the old newspapers and getting the Jay Greenbergs and the Steve Morantzes of the world, who were beat reporters for the Scouts. But the most difficult part, actually, was tracking down former characters to this book, primarily the former players. The ones I did get in touch with, most of them participated willingly in the project, and they were wonderful. I had a few that turned me down. I had a few that were willing at the beginning and for whatever reason decided not to participate later. I was very fortunate that I got in touch with the Scouts' lead legal counsel. Their general counsel, interviewed him twice in Kansas City. His name's Bob Fisher, G. Robert Fisher. And he was a young man back then, but he's still alive, you know, obviously. And he's got a good memory, and he's extremely helpful with the minutia involved with the ownership group. By the way, Bob was a minority owner in the franchise, but he represented them. He spoke to the NHL Board of Governors in this process leading up to the franchise coming to Kansas City. Also, the young trainer, you mentioned earlier there was tragedy involved with this franchise. Right. And the original trainer, early in the first season, 1974-75, killed himself. And his young assistant, a native Kansas City, and because of that, he was thrown into a bad situation. And the gentleman that died, Gordon Marchand, was this young man's mentor. And in fact, it encouraged Dale Graham is the young man, and he encouraged Dale to go to college and get a degree, which was rare for athletic trainers back in that day. So Dale was very helpful as a source as well, but it goes back to the players and gentlemen like Robin Burns and Gary Crotto and Randy Rhoda, Peter McDuffe, Dennis Herron. The last two gentlemen were goaltenders, and in fact, it's funny, I stay in touch with the McDuffes and two of their sons, but interestingly enough, in the book, the funny stories is told by Peter McDuffe's wife. And long story short, it's in the book, but Peter is with the Scouts in Kansas City. He's the backup goalie to Dennis Herron, and they beat the Boston Bruins at the Garden 3-2. At that time, it was obviously the biggest win in Scouts history. But back in Kansas City, the McDuffe's apartment was robbed, and
right.
They left some Canadian money. They left a tea kettle, and they left a Sears sewing machine. No, they left the lid to the Sears sewing machine, but they took the sewing machine. And so Mary McDuffe is telling me they came back to their apartment. It's across the Missouri River in North Kansas City, and she's scared to death. She's pregnant. They have a young child already, and her husband's on the road, and there weren't cell phones obviously back then. So it's little stories within the story. That one from Mrs. Mary McDuffe, the wife of one of the Scouts goaltenders, that I think adds some spice to this book.
No question. And one of the things that adds spice to the book too is we get little glimpses of opponents, other people involved in hockey, little notes on like guys like Bill Goldsworthy, for example. And one of the little side steps you have there is you talk about the legendary Dan Kelly, voice of the St. Louis Blues, hockey on CBS, etc. And boy, when you hear that voice of Dan Kelly, it's just like the voice of God in hockey. For myself, you just it's unbelievable. I had a chance to meet him when he was a broadcaster. He would come into Hartford, and it was a great thrill. But talk a little bit about Dan Kelly, and I know you've had the opportunity to meet him, and just talk about Dan and how you came to include him in this book on the Scouts.
Well, unlike you, Mark, I thought he was God. And he not only was outstanding at hockey, but here in the Midwest, he was the voice of the University of Missouri football games. He did NFL games when the Cardinals were still in St. Louis before they moved to Arizona. And gosh, when you turn on the Blues telecast now, and here is some John. I mean, John sounds just like his old man. And the older that John gets, the more he looks like his old man. John, by the way, did return a telephone call to me regarding that portion of the book when I wrote about his father. But I recount in Icing on the Plains that my one and only encounter with Dan Kelly, and it's a true story. It's going to be a sad story, but it's a true one. In 1988, the Blues were playing an exhibition game at Kemper Arena in Kansas City. It was against the Chicago Blackhawks. Mike Keenan was the coach, and I'm pretty sure it was Jeremy Roenick's rookie season with the Blackhawks. Well,
right.
Dan's broadcasting this game back to St. Louis on KMOX radio, 50,000 water, and I had a press pass because I was covering the game for Missouri Net, a statewide radio network, mostly small stations across the Show Me State. Well, I just took it upon myself to walk into his booth, and so I can't remember which intermission it was, first or second or third. I think it's in the book actually, but at the end of the first or second period, whichever one it was, he recapped and then threw it back to KMOX. Customarily, they would fill a lot of the intermission with news and weather updates back in St. Louis at the studio. Well, he does that. He didn't take off his headphones because, as John confirmed to me, Dan Kelly never wore headsets. He broadcast his entire career just using a handheld microphone, as if he was an MC of something. But anyway, I'm getting off the beaten path. Anyway, he turns around, lights a cigarette, and notices me standing there. And he goes, Who are you? You have a press pass? And I thought I was going to be in trouble, the legend. And then he noticed my pass, and I completely disarmed him when I said, Mr. Kelly, I think you're the greatest. I just wanted to watch your work. And he melted. I mean, he was cool from there on out. But here's the sad part of the story. Again, this is the fall of 1988. He reaches back with one of his hands and starts rubbing above his buttocks area and says, my back is killing me. Well, I think about 2 or 3 weeks later is when he was diagnosed with spinal cancer.
Wow.
He died in February of 1989. So he only had a few months to live when I met him that night in September 1988 in Kansas City, Missouri.
And obviously one of those lessons of life, a good decision for you to take that step and say hello to him, because you wouldn't have had that.
Yeah, and he again, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Mark.
No,
I'm sorry. He understandably wanted to know who the heck this guy, kid was in his booth. But once and by the way, when he said, Mr. Kelly, I'm I was nervous.
Mm-hmm.
I was nervous. But once I got out, Spout was trying to tell me it was beyond gracious.
Absolutely. When we talk about interesting characters, another one, of course, the Kansas City Scouts, none other than the notorious Steve Durbano. And he was part of Scouts history. I think did I read it in your book or somewhere else? He got into a fight and somebody ripped his toupee off. And
that was Dave Hutchison of the.
Oh, that's right. Team. Of course, that's right. And so, but question, just looking back to give you an open-ended question, Steve Durbano's impact on the Kansas City Scouts, and he was, I hate to say it sounds derogatory, damaged goods by that point. He had injured his wrist or his hand. Wasn't the same player who was a number 1 draft pick. People forget he was the first-round draft pick, New York Rangers. Did have some talent, but of course had some other issues that mitigated that talent. But talk a little bit about Steve's days in Kansas City.
Well, he was brought in via trade from the Pittsburgh Penguins about midway through the second season, 1975-76, and he was brought in to try to sell tickets, quite frankly. And in addition to that, they needed some muscle. And if nothing else, Steve Durbano, injured hand and all, could provide muscle. And he would take on all comers in a fight. And as you allude to, prior to the hand injury, I want to say that might have been when, he was with the Pittsburgh Penguins, and he suffered a serious hand injury in a season opener, but I'm not sure which season that was. Nevertheless, he had hockey skill, and Abel is quoted in the book as saying, the coach, we're talking about Bep here, can get him to settle down, but Abel alluded to the fact that the guy had hockey skill. And so they brought him in. He instigated a fiasco at the Odd in Buffalo. The deal with the toupee, that actually occurred in the Scouts' final ever home game at Kemper Arena. In the tussle, Hutch somehow gets the toupee off, but what particularly infuriated Durbano was Hutch grabbed his stick, I guess, after they'd fought, and shot the toupee, sort of like Scott Mellenby with the rat back in the early Florida Panthers days. And that infuriated Durbano, and he's ejected, and he threw the practice pylons out on the ice. He threw his skates out on the ice, and before this game was over, he had time to shower and go enjoy a steak up in the arena club before the game was over. But I do want to emphasize in regard to Steve Durbano in my book. Yes, if you're going to chronicle the Kansas City Scouts, you must include Steve Durbano, but his post-hockey life, where he had a lot of legal issues and things like that, I do not belabor those. The man is deceased, so as a result, obviously, he cannot defend himself from the grave. He cannot try to justify some of his actions off the ice or on the ice. It's all over the internet how Steve Durbano's life went after he left hockey. TSN in Canada contacted me and wanted me to participate in a podcast about Durbano.
Right.
And I quickly got the impression from the producer where this was going to go. And I just told him, I'm not interested in piling on the guy. And as a result, I never heard back from him. So that's what it is.
I can appreciate your approach to that. And I had this discussion, I have a teenage son, and, I have this discussion with him all the time about you don't know where people are coming from all the time. You don't know what their background was, what their life was when they were a kid, and the interdynamics of families, and et cetera, et cetera.
Sure.
So I can certainly...
And my understanding is, sorry to interrupt you, Mark, but I think Steve and his father had a difficult relationship from what I've gathered.
Yeah, it was a volatile relationship from what I've heard. I think they lived across the street from the Papin family, and I recall them saying that it could be pretty raucous over there at the Durbanos. So it's one of those things that Steve Durbano, like most people, did not want to go down deep inside, did not want to go down the road he went down. And, whatever circumstances came into his decision-making at the time ended up having extremely negative results for him and those around him. However, but I could certainly appreciate your approach to that. On a different note, and somebody whose career shone brightly after he left Kansas City and whose life after that was very positive, and participating in your book was a guy who could have lost his confidence very much so playing goal for the Kansas City Scouts, was Denis Herron, who played well, earned a lot of respect, ended up winning a Vezina Trophy, I believe, with the Montreal Canadiens. You had a chance to talk to Denis, and how was his reflections of his days in Kansas City?
He told me that it was one of the best moves early in his career, traded by the Penguins at Kansas City, and he got a lot of games. I kind of equate Denis's career early on with that of Joe Meloche.
Yeah, very good point.
Yeah, they both played on poor teams. They were good goaltenders, good young goaltenders, but they just played on, for the most part, terrible teams. Jill, especially, out in Oakland. And, he went on to tremendous success with the Minnesota North Stars and later the Pittsburgh Penguins, particularly Minnesota. But, Denny was terrific. He started playing goal at the age of 5 when his dad asked him to step into the position. And Denis has done very well for himself. He got into international sales with some resorts down in South Florida. And since Denis is bilingual, he's able to work with potential clients in France and in some of those islands, Caribbean, where the resorts are. They bring in a lot of Europeans and whatnot. But then he did mention, he's famous for getting kidney stones because of the milkshake diet. And,
oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah. I had read, and I think it was one of those old Xander Hollander preview books.
I love those
back
books.
In the year. Yeah, I did too.
God, I love those books.
I got every sport. I got the NBA, the NFL, the MLB. But anyway, I had always been under the understanding that the Scouts had asked him to go on this high-protein milkshake diet. Well, it turns out, then he told me, no, that was my idea. And he was just pouring the protein milkshakes down, trying to gain weight, because as Robin Burns told me, if in the dressing room, without his equipment on, if Denis turned sideways, you wouldn't see him. He just was thin as a rail. He wasn't all that tall either. Well, anyway, he's working out with Gary Crotto the summer of 1975 in the off season. Kansas City summers are hot. He's still sucking down all these protein milkshakes. Well, it led to a kidney stone. And the story's in the book. Apparently, when Debbie Herron was taking her husband to the hospital, they didn't know what was wrong with him other than he had severe pain in his abdominal area. He was pounding on the dashboard of the Herron's car. And I've never had a kidney stone, and I don't think I want to, Mark, just because of the kidney and where the stone has to go to be expelled, et cetera, et cetera. But Denis was very helpful with the book, and I appreciate it. All the players that agreed to work with me, they were fabulous.
One question I wanted to ask you is, when you've had the chance to get the book to the players, I saw the picture of Randy Rhoda, and of course talked to Robin Burns, who really liked the book. So what kind of feedback do you get from the players and those who participated in the book?
I haven't gotten any criticism. Maybe the guys were blowing smoke up my butt, but they've been complimentary. I think one of the reasons, and Robin mentioned this specifically, I think one of the reasons the guys kind of like it is it takes them back to when they were young men, and they were athletes, and they were playing in the National Hockey League. In Robin's case, yeah, he played a little bit with the Pittsburgh Penguins, but as he said, he was riding the toilet mostly between Pittsburgh and Hershey in the American League. Well, Robin's NHL career, for the most part, in its entirety, was the 2 years playing for the Kansas City Scouts. And I hope you enjoyed visiting with Robin as much as I did. He's an amazing man. I've tried to tell him he needs to write his own book, and I know some of the kids are trying to tell him to write his own book. It's an amazing story. And then Randy Rhoda, he'd be the first to admit to you that he wasn't any kind of star player, probably a third or fourth line forward. But in his case, he just signed a new contract with the Los Angeles Kings, and then practically the same day, Bob Polford left him exposed in the expansion draft, so he moved to Kansas City. He tells him a particular one, including the recently McDuffies. They were fabulous. Gary Crocco, I tell you what, he is an interesting dude because he's very cerebral. At least he was in my conversations, and that makes sense. Mm-hmm. He was basically the first Canadian to graduate American college to make it in the National Hockey League. And, Robin Burns can be very, high intelligent, cerebral, as I said before. And then Robin, he can put a stick move like a football running back, and on a dime, he'll have you laughing so hard you're falling on the floor. Gary, very well spoken, and he was very, very helpful with the book. And for those that do purchase Icing on the Plains, I hope they enjoy it in its entirety. But I chronicle in the book Gary all the way from his youth through St. Lawrence to making it to the National Hockey League. And like a lot of people, I'm pretty sure Gary was the first person in his family to go to college.
Right.
And the alternative in Sudbury, Ontario, was working in the mines. And Gary did that a couple of summers. He was at St. Lawrence. And he did it not only to earn money, but he was already smart enough. He wanted the reminder of, I don't want to be a miner all my life like my father and brother. So many thanks to Gary Crocco, too. All the guys were very helpful.
Someone else you mentioned earlier who was also helpful to you, and I had forgotten or did not know that Jay Greenberg, who I associate with Philadelphia hockey in general,
sure,
was beat writer for the Kansas City Scouts, and I did not know that. Talk about his impact on being able to pull this book together.
He had an incredible impact. I don't know of any other big league broadcast or writer, and let's just stay with the writers. I don't know if anybody other than Jay would have sent somebody he'd never met before 100 copies of his clippings while he was working for the Kansas City Star and Kansas City Times.
Wow.
And I think Jay can kind of fall into the category with the players, too, because Jay was a recent graduate of the University of Missouri Journalism School. I was fortunate enough to be hired in Kansas City. And then he got the Scouts beat because all the vets in the sports department, they didn't want to have anything to do with the hockey team. Well, Jay's from Johnstown, Pennsylvania. Slapshot. You know, I mean, he's all for it. It's like he says, I'm 24 years old, and I'm flying all over the country on my own major beat. He loved it. Mm-hmm. Jay's insight, obviously, goes without saying. He having his insight. You know, Jay's in a, you know, he was honored by the Hockey Hall of Fame. I don't think they have a wing in the Hockey Hall of Fame for writers and broadcasters, but they're recognized. And and I mean, he does the first season as the beat reporter, and then he moves on after the first season to the then Philadelphia Bulletin, and then, as you alluded to, Mark, that's where he began his long association with the Philadelphia Flyers.
Your book brought back a lot of faint memories in some cases. I did see the Scouts play actually live. I saw them at the Boston Garden against Bobby Orr and Brad Park in November of 75. It was one of the 10 games that Park and Orr played together. Bruins ended up prevailing in the game. I remember the Goal magazine cover was Eddie Gilbert of Kansas City. Oh. But one stretch postseason event, I think it was after year 2 perhaps, but the Washington Capitals and the Kansas City Scouts pack up at the end of the season, go to Japan. Can you talk a little bit about that? I totally had forgotten about that series of games they played. You can tell our fans a little bit about that sequence of events.
Well, that's crazy, Mark, that whole Japanese. I mean, what I can tell, the NHL had agreed to partner up with Coca-Cola Bottling Company to have some exhibition games in Japan after the season. Well, the Scouts and the Capitals were both so bad, so early, or, you know, as the 75-76 season progressed, that they had no chance of making the playoffs well before the playoffs were going to occur. So, by default, the Caps and the Scouts were sent to Japan. They played 4 games, the first 2 in Sapporo, up in the northern part of Japan, where the 1972 Winter Olympics were held, and then they played the other 2 games in Tokyo. Mm-hmm. And, for example, Randy Rhoda told me for the book that the guys loved it. They got a pretty impressive per diem, and Dale Graham said that the guys from both teams put on a good show. They had some fights, but it wasn't exact. I guess it was more, you know, the WWF variety or whatever. And so they entertained the Japanese, but the Japanese that attended these games were just in awe of what they were seeing, and they found the most interesting, fascinating. And a player went. Japanese were fascinated with the fact that this person was sentenced to isolation, and sort of like Denis Lee character in the movie Slapshot. You feel shame and everything, and the Japanese people by and large are very respectful, and a lot of them usually are. They're not real tall. Well, they're looking at these guys out on the ice, and of course with the skate blades underneath their feet, they probably look like giants. But I think the most bizarre piece of Scouts history is probably involved with Japan, because obviously those 4 games against the Capitals didn't count. And Washington won the first 3 games. And then they won the first 2 up north, won the next one in Tokyo. The Kansas City Scouts had they ended the regular season with a 27-game winless streak. A few ties trickled in there, but they had won in 27 games. Then they lose their first 3 in Japan, so that's a 30-game winless streak. In the final game of that 4-game series, the Scouts defeated the Washington Capitals. So it can be said that the Kansas City Scouts won their last ever game, but it did not count.
When I look, speaking of that high point in Kansas City history, I was curious, in your opinion, now there were some high points, victories. I believe they beat the Boston Bruins once. But what was the high point of the Kansas City Scouts hockey when things looked good or things were looking optimistic and they scored a big victory? I know that if I recall the book and the times correctly, they actually had a decent stretch through. They're talking about this with Robin Burns through maybe December of '75, and then everything just fell apart inexplicably. Really, I guess that's one question I wanted to ask you. Is I think it was ended up being like a 44-game stretch where they won once. Like, what was the catalyst for that, based on the fact that they actually had a somewhat decent start to the 75-76 season?
Yeah, early in October of that season, Scouts were in first place for about 10 minutes. They'd won a couple and lost a couple, tied. They were picking up points here and there, but as you alluded to, pretty much in the middle of the final season, everything went to hell in a handbasket. Beth Gittleman resigned. That was a crazy deal right there. It's in the book. But backtracking, before the rink fell in, you asked about the highest point in Scouts history. Well, that happened before the collapse in December of '75. They upset the Montreal Canadiens 6-5 at Kemper Arena. And I don't need to tell you, the Canadiens won the Stanley Cup that year, the first of 4 straight.
Right.
And Wilfred Paiement, then in his second season, registered the first and only hat trick in Scouts history. And as Robin said for the book, that was, for the Scouts, that was like winning their mini Stanley Cup. And I heard at one point back in the day the California Golden Seals broke some kind of, no, it was the Washington Capitals in their first season. They broke some kind of streak, and they found a 10 garbage can, and they went out and hoisted it like it was their Stanley Cup. I don't think the Scouts did anything like that, but it certainly was a high point for the franchise. And then you mentioned the victories. Actually, they won both seasons on one occasion at Boston Garden. Of course, the second year the Bruins didn't have Bobby Orr. But yeah, that whole deal down the stretch, it avalanched. Some acquisitions didn't work out. I mean, the Durbano trade, purely from a player standpoint, yeah, they got Chuck Arneson in the deal along with Turbo, but they parted ways with Simone Nolet, their first captain, and Ed Gilbert. Eddie been struggling scoring goals in that second season in Kansas City, but reverting back to the 1970 expansion draft, Simone Nolet was an excellent selection by Sid Abel. So they lost some leadership there, and there was turmoil between the coach and a certain segment of the rest of the room. And Gittleman resigned to the Huff, and lifer named Eddie Bush from Collingwood, Ontario, came in, and he knew he wasn't going to be able to clean this thing up. And then while that's happening on the ice, then the franchise is leaking oil everywhere, as a business, and so because of the confluence of circumstances, Kansas City Scouts played their last game in Tokyo, Japan.
Yes, they did, and of course, from beginning to the end, it's captured here in Icing on the Plains, The Rough Ride of Kansas City's NHL Scouts by Troy Treasure. Again, I really enjoyed the book. Thoroughly enjoyed talking to you about Kansas City Scouts history. Congratulations on an outstanding job. And we'll have links in the show notes, of course, where you can, fans can purchase the book directly. But now that you've written the book, Troy, on the Kansas City Scouts, do you have anything else on the horizon, so to speak, from a hockey or sports standpoint that you want to tackle next?
Not really in sports. It's probably my next book if I do it. And any author will tell you, you've got to be all in. You can't do it halfway. But here in the American Midwest, there was a young politician who died on a plane crash at the age of 39, and many people think he eventually would have become president of the United States. And so I'm looking hard at that. But it was a labor of love. When you look back on your childhood, I think most folks will agree that, some of it becomes kind of fantasy. I don't know. When you're young, your imagination runs. And so as I look back now, I guess I was 49 when I started the project, or maybe just 50. I'm 50. I'm 53 now. Anyway, it took me back to my childhood, and that was a fun part of my childhood, hockey, and really enjoyed it. You tell Robin Burns, anybody listening, tell Robin Burns he needs to write his book. Mark, I think you'll agree. He just has an amazing story.
He changed hockey. He changed the game.
He invented the hockey visor.
Right.
And he played. I wasn't a superstar by any stretch of the imagination. And he overcame childhood adversity, health-wise, and just an amazing guy.
He sure is, and you have to look past the self-effacing humor and everything and look at his endless list of accomplishments off the ice, and having accomplished all that and staying extremely humble and grounded says a lot about him. And I appreciate, because eventually obviously we had talked with Robin in our previous episode to recording this, and that was directly as a result of you putting me in contact with him. So we greatly appreciate that, and more importantly, greatly appreciate you bringing the Kansas City Scouts back to life. Great effort on your part. Thanks so much for being here today, and Troy, we look forward to staying in contact as well.
Mark, thank you, and I just want to give you personally a shout-out. These podcasts are great. I particularly love the one with Randy Maneri, former Atlanta Flame. I guess he started with the Detroit Red Wings, but I remember him primarily with the Atlanta Flames, the LA Kings. I love the Denis Sobchuk podcast you did because as a kid, I lived the Stingers games on Cincinnati's a big one, WLW. And I just love how you're tackling hockey history and keeping it alive. Buddy, you keep up the good work.
I sure will, Troy. Thanks so much for the inspiration, kind words, and look forward to talking to you again real soon. I thought it was fitting to conclude this show, which had a real mid-1970s feel to it, with the expansion Kansas City Scouts, international competition, and the World Hockey Association, with an interview between Stan Fischler and Howard Baldwin, who was the president of the World Hockey Association and, of course, was the founder of the Whalers franchise. And they talk about the challenges facing the game in mid-70s. It's a nice little time capsule and prescient as both looked to the future of what would help get the game back in order after a long and brutal battle between the two leagues, the NHL and the WHA.
Thank you, Spence. The man on my left, a very happy man right now, is Howard Baldwin, who is the president of the Whalers and a man who has some interesting ideas about international hockey. What I want to know is whether there's ever going to be an intercontinental hockey league.
Well, I don't know about an intercontinental hockey league, but I can see in the future there being a division that plays during the regular season, an intertwined schedule with our league, and we go over there for a series of games, and the games count in the standings. I think that's what we're heading towards, and I think that would be good for hockey.
What about this Whaler team? How do you explain this first period, Howard? A lot of people were feeling sorry for your club before the opening face-off.
Well, we've had kind of a fall where we've struggled a bit, We've been inconsistent, and the unfortunate thing is that we've played better on the road than at home, but here we are tonight playing without Abrahamson, Lee, and so it really are three top defensemen, and we're leading 3-1. I don't want to explain it. I just want to sit back and enjoy it and hope that 40 minutes from now the score is the same or even more lopsided than it is now. I hope we can keep it up because it's really exciting for us and for our fans.
Howard Baldwin, one of the most candid executives in professional hockey. A lot of people are wondering what's going to happen in the great long war between the NHL and the WHA. What do you see happening? Will there ever be a merger?
Well, I think that we all better get smart and better get together and at least talk about what's good for professional hockey and what's in the best interest, not only for ownership, but for players and also for the fans. I think that what you see now is a very bad situation, and the problem is that we all can't get together and talk about it, and that's because half the people have their heads buried in sand and the other half of people want to do something about it, and we got to get more people that want to do something about it because it's a great game, and the fans are reacting by staying away at the turnstiles, and that tells me anyway we better pull our heads out of the sand and get together and put a better product on the ice and a more competitive product on the ice, or there'll be a few people out of business.
Well, you got détente with the Soviet team. You seem to be able to work out a pretty good
schedule with them. How come you can't get détente with the NHL, or will you ever get it? Do you think it'll ever happen, Howard? Well, I think it'll happen because I think they got some smart people over there that realize that in the best interest of hockey, everybody should get together in some way. I don't know whether it's a merger or what, but we all should sit down and figure out what's best for professional hockey, what's best for the franchises and for the players and for the fans, and come up with a logical solution. And as long as people will recognize there's a problem, then they got to realize that there's a solution to it and sit down and try to solve it. If they do that, it can be solved. But if we all just try to avoid it, then we can't solve it.
Thank you for listening to the Pro Hockey Alumni Podcast, the voice of hockey legends. If you enjoy listening to the show, please consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing the show on iTunes. This helps make our podcast more visible and accessible to hockey fans around the world. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for the show, please contact me at prohockeyalumni.org or via social media at Pro Hockey Alumni. The Pro Hockey Alumni greatly appreciates your support.